celebrations are magnificent, at the heart of the pageantry is a simple message: service.
For 20 years, Prince William carried a promise so private that even those closest to the throne never heard its full wording. But when he finally revealed what he had sworn to Queen Elizabeth about the crown, the palace did not react with relief. It reacted with silence. Because this was not a gentle tribute to the past, it was a declaration that changed the future. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William did not raise his voice when he broke the silence. He placed a sealed note on the table during a private royal gathering at Windsor and let the room understand, second by second, that this was not rumor, memory, or emotional invention. The crown, the royal authority and duty that sits above personal feelings, family wishes, and private influence, had been placed at the center of one final promise. The prince revealed through that documented private gathering that, shortly before the Queen's final years, he had sworn to protect it from personal ambition, private manipulation, and anyone who tried to place themselves above duty. Charles sat motionless as the words landed. His hand rested near the note, close enough to claim it, but not close enough to touch it. The king looked proud of his son for honoring Elizabeth, yet afraid of what that honor now suggested about his own reign. William kept his restraint like armor, but everyone could see the cost. He was not attacking his father, and he was not trying to wound the monarch. Still, every sentence felt like a line drawn through years of quiet compromise, a warning that love could no longer excuse blurred authority. The sealed note mattered, because it carried Elizabeth's own markings, small signs recognized by a senior courtier who had served her for years. That courtier stared at the page and understood before anyone said it aloud. This promise was real, deliberate, and preserved for the exact moment when silence would become more dangerous than truth. Charles finally looked from the paper to William, and the distance between father and son suddenly felt wider than the room itself. The condition inside the promise changed everything. William had sworn that if he ever believed the crown was being softened, redirected, or privately influenced away from Elizabeth's standards, he would act. Not later. Not politely. Not only when it was easy. He would act when duty demanded it, even if the cost fell inside his own family. That was why the room froze. That was why Catherine, standing near him, watched his face with quiet concern. That was why Camilla's stillness carried its own confession of fear. The most painful question was no longer what William had promised. It was who Elizabeth feared might one day force him to keep that promise. And as the room absorbed the weight of William's words, every eye began turning toward the people who now stood closest to the crown. A royal promise is never just about one person. It reaches into marriages, loyalties, rivalries, wounds, and all the private fears hidden behind public smiles. As William's revelation spreads through the family, the palace stops feeling like a residence and starts feeling like a chamber of judgment, where every face reveals what no official statement would dare admit. William stood at the center of it all, not simply as Elizabeth's grandson, but as the future king who had now claimed the moral burden of guarding the crown's original purpose. The crown was never just a jewel, a throne, or a title. It was the living weight of duty, the power passed from sovereign to sovereign, and the promise that personal desire must never rise higher than service. That was why his revelation cut so deeply. He was not speaking as a son seeking influence. He was speaking as the heir who believed the late monarch had left him a duty that could no longer be ignored. And in that room, every person understood that his words had moved beyond memory. They had become a warning. Charles felt that warning more sharply than anyone. The king was suddenly placed between two forces he could not easily escape: his mother's unbending expectations and his son's willingness to enforce them. He had spent his life preparing for the throne, yet now the throne itself seemed to be answering through Elizabeth's final trust in William. That truth did not humiliate him in a public way. It wounded him in a private one. He looked at the prince and saw not rebellion, but resolve. And that made it harder to dismiss. If William had been angry, Charles could have challenged him. If he had been ambitious, the monarch could have condemned him. But the future king looked burdened, and burden is much harder to fight than pride. Catherine watched William with a concern only she could hide well. She knew this was not a grab for power. It was sacrifice wearing the face of calm. She saw the cost in his stillness, the way he chose every word as if one careless phrase could split the family further. The princess understood that duty was pulling him away from comfort, away from peace, and toward a confrontation he had never wanted. Camilla felt the room shift around her too. William never named her directly, yet the promise challenged anyone whose influence could be seen as personal rather than constitutional. Constitutional authority meant power clearly tied to official royal duty, not private closeness, private access, or private persuasion. And because of that, silence became more dangerous than accusation. Sophie remembered something then, a conversation with Elizabeth that had once sounded almost gentle. The late Queen had called William the keeper of the line, and at the time, the trusted confidant had heard affection in it. Now she heard instruction. Anne recognized it too. The Princess Royal knew Elizabeth would never ask for such a promise, unless she had already sensed danger forming inside the family structure. The Queen had prepared for a future confrontation long before anyone else admitted it could come. Yet none of them could understand the full meaning until the hidden incident from 20 years earlier was finally brought back into the light. Because before William ever made that promise, one unforgettable moment convinced Elizabeth that the future of the crown needed a guardian. Long before the final promise was revealed, there was one night inside Windsor when everything changed. It was not a public scandal, not a televised speech, and not a constitutional crisis. It was quieter than that, and far more dangerous. A conversation ended, a door closed, and Elizabeth saw clearly that the monarchy's greatest threat might one day come from within its own walls. William was younger then, still learning that monarchy was not held together by gold, ceremony, or applause, but by discipline no one was allowed to see. The 2006 Windsor Library conversation became the hidden trigger, the private moment everyone later looked back on as the point of no return. Windsor was not just a royal home in this story, it was the place where family life and sovereign duty collided under one roof. A senior discussion had unfolded nearby, and Elizabeth overheard aides debating how future royal influence could be reshaped around personal households rather than inherited duty. Personal households meant the private teams surrounding individual royals, the small circles of advisors, friends, and staff who could quietly shape access, decisions, and loyalties. To others, it may have sounded like planning. To the Queen, it sounded like danger. Elizabeth did not rage when the room emptied. She called William into the library and faced him with a question that reached far beyond his age. Did he understand, she asked, the difference between affection for family and obedience to the crown? The prince was shaken, because the question carried a future he had never wanted to imagine. Family was supposed to be the safe place. The crown was supposed to be the duty above it. But Elizabeth forced him to see the brutal truth. One day, those two loyalties could pull in opposite directions, and he would not be allowed to hide behind love. William listened as the monarch spoke with sorrow instead of anger, and that sorrow made the warning even heavier. Elizabeth placed her hand over a red dispatch box and told him that weakness often enters palaces dressed as kindness. A red dispatch box is the locked case used to carry official papers for the monarch, and in that moment, it became more than a container. It became a symbol of every decision that must stay above private pressure. The Queen asked William for a promise that night. If the crown ever risked becoming a tool for comfort, access, or personal influence, he would restore its discipline, no matter how painful. He understood then that she was not preparing him for glory. She was preparing him for sacrifice. William later revealed through the sealed handwritten note that the promise had been recorded after that conversation and preserved under Elizabeth's instruction. The note was held back because the monarch knew timing mattered. A warning spoken too early becomes family tension. A warning revealed too late becomes damage. That was the cruelty of the burden she placed on him. He had to wait until silence became more dangerous than truth. But a promise made in youth becomes far more dangerous when the people it affects are seated across the table decades later. And when William finally decides the promise can no longer remain hidden, the confrontation becomes unavoidable. The most explosive royal confrontations rarely happen before cameras. They happen in private rooms, where polished voices crack and old loyalties are tested in the space between one sentence and the next. When William faces Charles after revealing Elizabeth's promise, the moment becomes more than a disagreement. It becomes a collision between a reigning king and the son prepared to inherit his unfinished battles. Charles knew the room had changed before either of them spoke again. The private sitting room at Windsor, usually a place for controlled conversation and careful family language, now felt like the center of a storm. A private sitting room meant a closed royal space, where the family could speak without aides, officials, or formal records shaping every word. That mattered, because this meeting could not be softened by advisors or hidden behind protocol. The king asked William whether he truly understood the consequence of placing Elizabeth's words above his father's judgment. The question carried pain, but also warning. Charles was not only challenging his son, he was defending the dignity of his reign. William did not step back. The prince answered with the same quiet force that had made the original revelation so dangerous. The promise, he said, was not above Charles. It was beneath the crown itself, the foundation on which every reign must stand. The crown, in this moment, meant more than a royal symbol. It meant the duty, restraint, and moral order that kept personal wishes from taking control of monarchy. That answer wounded the king because it left him no easy place to stand. If he rejected it, he seemed to reject Elizabeth. If he accepted it, he accepted that his own reign could be measured against a promise given to his son. Charles rose from his chair, hurt flashing through his restraint. He had waited a lifetime to become monarch, yet here stood William, not rebellious, not cruel, but immovable. That made the confrontation more painful. The future king remained near the fireplace, fighting to keep emotion from overtaking discipline. He loved his father, but love could not erase what Elizabeth had placed in his hands. Outside the room, Catherine waited in silence. She heard only fragments, but fragments were enough. Charles's voice lowered. William stopped responding for several long seconds. The princess understood that the silence was not weakness. It was the sound of a family holding itself together by force. William finally spoke the phrase that changed the air between them. Elizabeth had feared soft power without accountability. The words landed with devastating precision. Soft power meant private influence that shapes decisions without holding an official role or public responsibility. Charles understood immediately why the phrase cut so deep. It did not accuse one person outright, yet it challenged every circle, every companion, every quiet advisor who had mistaken closeness to the throne for a right to guide it. The king asked whether this promise was meant to restrain Camilla's circle. William did not deny it. He simply said the crown must never be surrounded by people who mistake proximity for authority. Charles looked at his son then, and the anger began turning into something heavier: fear. Not fear of William, but fear of what Elizabeth had seen before anyone else dared to name it. The confrontation did not end with shouting. It ended with the king asking who now held the right to enforce her final instruction. And that question pulls the story away from emotion and into the hidden machinery of royal power. Behind every royal gesture lies a structure most people never see. Titles may glitter, carriages may roll, and ceremonies may dazzle. But true power often rests in signatures, private instructions, sealed records, and the people trusted to interpret them. Once William's promise is revealed, the palace must confront the question that terrifies everyone. Did Elizabeth leave him only a memory, or a mandate? William understood that the confrontation with Charles had opened a door no one could quietly close again. A small group of trustees and senior advisors gathered to review Elizabeth's sealed instruction, and the mood inside that meeting carried the weight of something larger than family pain. Trustees, in plain terms, were the people trusted to guard certain royal instructions, estate matters, and private duties, according to rules set before them. Senior advisors were not there to create drama. They were there to interpret whether the Queen's words carried force beyond emotion. And when they began reading, the answer became impossible to soften. The promise was connected to internal protocols governing access, influence, and ceremonial authority, meaning it touched the very system that decided who could enter certain rooms, attend certain briefings, and shape certain royal decisions. Charles listened as each sentence narrowed the space around him. The decision did not make William king before his time, and no one dared suggest that it did. But it gave the prince moral and procedural weight whenever he believed royal boundaries were being crossed. Procedural weight meant his objections could no longer be treated as personal discomfort or family tension. They had to be considered as part of the monarchy's own protective structure. That mattered because the crown could not survive if private influence wore the mask of loyalty. It mattered because Elizabeth had seen how affection, access, and habit could slowly become power without anyone formally granting it. The king looked older as the explanation unfolded, not defeated, but deeply wounded by the realization that his mother had prepared safeguards beyond his personal control. Sophie watched the advisors speak and felt the sadness of Elizabeth's foresight. The trusted confidant understood that the late monarch had not planned for victory. She had planned for pain. That was the terrible beauty of it. Elizabeth had loved her family, yet she had still prepared for the possibility that duty would one day require limits inside that family. Sophie remembered the Queen's quiet way of speaking, the way she could make a warning sound like a prayer, and the memory cut through her as the clause was read aloud. No consort, no private family member, and no informal advisor should influence crown decisions without clear constitutional standing. Constitutional standing meant an official role recognized by duty, not closeness, affection, or personal access. William's role was then described in the sealed instruction as custodian of continuity, and the phrase changed everything. The prince was not handed a throne, but he was handed a responsibility that could no longer remain hidden. Charles looked toward him, and for a moment father and son both understood the cruelty of Elizabeth's wisdom. She had protected the monarchy by placing pain in William's hands. But once authority is clarified, the consequences begin moving quickly, and the first person to feel them is Camilla. Because the moment power is defined, everyone who once relied on blurred lines suddenly discovers the lines are real. The first sign of royal fallout is not always a dramatic announcement. Sometimes it is a changed seating plan, a cancelled briefing, a name quietly removed from a private schedule. After William's promise becomes active within palace life, the atmosphere shifts with chilling speed. Doors that once opened easily now require permission, and familiar privileges begin disappearing one by one. Camilla received the updated schedule without ceremony, and that made it more painful. No public rebuke arrived. No loud command echoed through the palace. Instead, a quiet paper carried the force of a verdict. Palace staff had been given revised instructions limiting access to certain crown briefings, ceremonial planning papers, and private rooms connected to Elizabeth's preserved records. Crown briefings were private meetings where sensitive royal duties, public appearances, and institutional decisions were discussed before they reached the outside world. Ceremonial planning papers were the documents that shaped where each person stood, what role they played, and how power appeared during royal occasions. These details mattered because influence did not always arrive as an order. Sometimes it arrived as a seat at the table. Camilla slowly set the paper down, and her expression hardened as she understood the truth beneath the polite wording. The changes were presented as procedural, but everyone knew they were tied directly to William's revealed promise and Elizabeth's final warning about influence. Procedural changes sounded harmless from a distance, almost cold and administrative. But inside the monarchy they could change everything. They decided who entered certain rooms, who heard certain plans, and who quietly shaped the mood around the king. The queen consort was not being insulted in public. She was being reduced in structure. That was worse. Public embarrassment fades. Structural reduction remains. Charles felt the trap close around him. He wanted to defend his wife, yet he could not deny his mother's instruction without weakening the very authority he had inherited from her. The king said little, and his silence became more painful than any statement. If he fought William, he risked looking as though he opposed Elizabeth's final discipline. If he accepted the limits, he forced Camilla to bear the cost of a promise made years before she ever saw it. This was the brutal contrast at the heart of the monarchy. A crown can survive through restraint, but families often suffer because of it. William refused to celebrate the change. Catherine saw that clearly when he spoke to her in private, admitting that enforcing the promise felt less like victory and more like paying an old debt to Elizabeth. The prince had gained authority, but not peace. A long-standing private advisory meeting was quietly reorganized, and individuals who had once attended through personal connection rather than official function no longer appeared on the list. Official function meant a recognized duty, not closeness, comfort, or habit. That single adjustment sent a message through the palace stronger than any speech. Camilla understood the message too, and so did Charles. The new reality had arrived without shouting, but it had arrived completely. Yet the true turning point would not come through papers, protocols, or reorganized meetings. It would come through one private conversation that stripped the issue down to love, grief, and duty. And behind the formal machinery, William and Charles must finally speak as father and son, not monarch and heir. When the doors close and the advisors disappear, the crown becomes painfully human. A king is just a son, still measured against his mother. A future king is just a grandson trying to honor a promise that has cost him peace. In the quietest moment of the crisis, Charles and William face each other without ceremony, and the truth finally stops hiding behind duty. Charles made the invitation himself, and that alone told William this meeting would be different. Late in the evening, the king asked his son to come to a private room at Clarence's house, with no aides, no notes, and no formal record of what was said. Clarence's house was the royal residence, long connected to Charles's private life, a place where personal history carried as much weight as official rank. That mattered because this conversation could not survive if it became another palace file. It had to be spoken as father and son. It had to leave behind the cold language of access, authority, and procedure, because the wound between them was no longer only institutional, it was emotional. William entered carrying the same restraint that had steadied him from the beginning, but Charles saw the exhaustion beneath it. The promise was finally discussed, not as policy, but as grief. Policy meant rules, structures, and decisions that could be argued by advisors. Grief was different. Grief was Elizabeth's absence still shaping every choice they made. The prince had kept her words for years, and the king had only just learned how deeply his mother had trusted his son with a duty that touched the future of the monarchy. That truth hurt Charles more than he had expected. He admitted it quietly. Hearing that Elizabeth had placed this burden in William's hands felt like judgment from beyond the grave. William did not let the pain turn into accusation. He told his father that the Queen had not doubted Charles's heart. She had feared the loneliness of kingship. She had feared the pressure that could surround any monarch, slowly bending judgment through affection, comfort, fear, and the need not to stand alone. Kingship meant more than wearing the crown. It meant making decisions, while every personal relationship tried to pull close to power. Charles listened, and for the first time since the revelation, his anger began to lose its shape. He was still wounded, but now he understood that Elizabeth's warning was not a rejection of him. It was a warning about what the throne could do to anyone. William finally revealed the final wording of the promise, and the room seemed to hold its breath around it. "I will keep the crown higher than all of us, even when it breaks my heart." The prince had carried that sentence like a hidden scar. Charles reached for the note at last, touching it not as a king testing evidence, but as a son hearing his mother one more time. He read the line himself and understood its terrible mercy. The promise had never been designed to humiliate him. It had been designed to preserve what Elizabeth believed could still be saved. Charles looked back at William, and something in the silence softened. No grand forgiveness arrived. No easy ending healed the family in an instant. But the confrontation changed. The king saw duty where he had first felt defiance. The future king saw sorrow where he had feared resistance. By morning, that private reconciliation would begin reshaping the public story, but the world was already watching. And once the promise leaves palace walls, Britain turns the private burden into a national reckoning. By dawn, the monarchy's private crisis has become Britain's front-page obsession. The country wakes to the image of William not as a distant heir, but as the man entrusted with Elizabeth's unfinished command. Supporters call it loyalty. Critics call it a warning. But everyone understands one thing. The promise has turned royal duty into the most emotional story of the reign. William could no longer keep the burden inside palace walls. The statement came carefully, polished enough to protect the institution, but heavy enough to confirm that something serious had happened. The palace acknowledged that the prince had honored a personal promise made to Elizabeth concerning the protection of Crown standards and constitutional discipline. Crown standards meant the values, limits, and traditions expected of those who serve the monarchy. Constitutional discipline meant keeping royal influence tied to proper duty rather than private pressure. That mattered because the public was not hearing a simple family story. It was hearing that the late Queen's expectations still had force, even after her death, and that her grandson had been trusted to carry them into the most fragile part of the reign. Catherine stood beside William when he appeared briefly at a public engagement, and her nearness said what no statement could safely say. The prince looked composed, but unusually quiet, as if every polite word cost him more than the crowd could see. He had not gained glory from the revelation. He had gained exposure. People now saw him not only as the future king, but as the man who had chosen Elizabeth's command over family comfort. The princess remained close, steady and watchful, because she understood that public support could not remove private pain. Applause might rise outside, but inside the family, every echo still returned to Charles, Camilla, and the promise no one could unhear. Charles carried his own heaviness into a later appearance. The king did not look defeated, but he looked changed. His face held the strain of a man who had accepted both the pain and necessity of what his son had revealed. The palace statement avoided naming family tensions directly, but the public connected the meaning instantly. They remembered the access changes. They noticed the careful distance around Camilla. They sensed the strain behind the polite language. Camilla was not accused in open terms, yet the queen consort became part of the national reading of the moment, because the promise pointed toward influence, boundaries, and the danger of private closeness becoming public power. Outside Buckingham Palace, the reaction found its image. A crowd gathered beneath a newspaper board reading, "William's vow to Elizabeth, crown before family." Buckingham Palace, the most famous working home of the monarchy, became the place where private grief turned into public judgment. People stopped, stared, argued, and fell silent in front of those words. A major broadcaster framed the story as, "The day the late Queen's discipline returned to the monarchy through her grandson." And that line traveled quickly, because it captured what many felt, but could not fully explain. William's promise had become a national symbol. It was no longer just about one sealed note. It was about whether the monarchy could still place duty above comfort. William understood the danger of that symbol. Public approval can strengthen a royal figure, but it can also trap him inside expectations no human being can easily carry. Catherine knew it too, and Charles felt it most painfully. The king had accepted the promise as protection, but the world now treated it as a verdict. Still, public approval could not complete the story. Only one final judgment could explain what the promise truly changed inside the House of Windsor. And when the noise fades, the meaning of William's revelation becomes impossible to deny. In the end, William's promise was not a weapon, it was a burden. It did not crown him early, and it did not erase Charles's reign. It did something deeper. It reminded the monarchy that love, marriage, loyalty, and family feeling must all bow before the one thing Elizabeth protected until her final breath, the crown itself. William felt the silence differently now. The storm had passed through the palace, through the family, through the nation, and what remained was not victory. It was solemn peace. The prince had kept the promise, but keeping it had forced him to confront his father, unsettle the people he loved, and carry the queen's expectations into the open, where no one could pretend they did not exist. Guardian of continuity meant the person trusted to protect the monarchy's steady line from one reign to the next, and William now understood the weight of that title in his bones. It mattered, because this was not power seized early. It was duty accepted before comfort, before popularity, before family ease. He had not stepped over Charles. He had stood beneath the crown and held up the standard Elizabeth left behind. Charles remained king, but he was not unchanged. The monarch accepted the pain of the moment as part of his inheritance, because inheritance was never only jewels, homes, titles, or ceremony. it was also the unfinished burden of the person who came before. The crown, in plain terms, was the royal duty and authority that must stay higher than private wishes. And Charles finally understood why Elizabeth had guarded it so fiercely. His mother's final act was not distrust, it was protection. She had looked beyond one reign and into the next, knowing that the monarchy could not survive if affection became influence, and influence became control. The king carried that truth with sorrow, but also with acceptance. Camilla's place became permanently clarified, and that clarity changed the air around the reign. The queen consort was respected beside Charles, but her influence could never again blur the boundaries Elizabeth insisted must remain untouched. That did not erase her role. It defined it. Camilla understood the difference, even if the lesson came with humiliation. Catherine understood something deeper as she watched William carry the result with quiet restraint. The future king's reign had already begun in spirit, not through power, but through sacrifice. The princess saw that his greatest strength was not command. It was the willingness to suffer for a duty no one else could carry for him. William's promise became the defining moral line of the modern monarchy. Elizabeth had not given him a secret advantage. She had given him a sacred warning. The crown survives only when those closest to it are willing to place it above themselves. Charles accepted that warning. William fulfilled it. Catherine stood beside the burden it created. Camilla learned the limit it imposed. And so the final promise is fulfilled. Not with celebration, not with revenge, but with the quiet restoration of the crown's highest law, duty before all. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.